apologies for absence? No apologies? There are no apologies. At this point, it is left to me to welcome everyone, members, officials from the Ministry, Auditor General and our staff, and other technical personnel who are here. It's the first meeting of the new financial year of this committee, and we hope in the coming months to get through a lot of the work that remains to be done. I believe this is the last meeting at which we'll be considering audits relating to the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, and that will allow us to move on to another ministry after this meeting, which I suppose is a sign of some progress. And at this point, I would just ask that we go through the process of reading and confirming the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 13th of February of this year. Page 1, if there are any proposed corrections, please let us know. Page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, page 12, page 13, page 14. There being no proposed amendments, would someone care to move for the adoption of the minutes?
Chairman, the last adjournment, there be no further business. The meeting was adjourned at signed die.
That's a typo. We can remove the word at. Appreciate your eagle eye on the very last sentence of the minutes. Subject to that one correction, would someone care to move for the adoption of the minutes? Moved by Dr. Guy, seconded by Mr. Dunn. Thank you. And I just want to say, having read the minutes, I want to commend the person who compiled them. I thought they were very well done, given the somewhat technical discussion that took place last time round. Moving on to matters arising. Any matters arising? There being no matters arising, we will move to the meat of the matter for the day, which is at item 7 of the agenda, and is the review of the accounts of the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Ministry paper, and after that the Road Maintenance Fund. And okay. Madam Auditor General, if you could just open the batting, so to speak, on the briefing report, which is on the response to your 2016-17 annual report from the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. The prompt was circulated on Thursday, and as indicated, most of the matters raised in the annual report would have been substantially addressed by the ministry, as indicated by the status satisfied or keep in view. There was one matter that we were not satisfied, that the ministry had acknowledged that the action was actually a breach, and that is in relation to the unauthorized transfer of funds between financial patterns at year end. And in this regard, what the ministry did was to transfer sums of money to an account which was held in that account post the end of the financial year. Now, based on the constitutional requirement, which is further supported by the FAA Act, all ministries, departments, and agencies that are funded by the Consolidated Fund are required, unless specifically provided with expressed approval, to surrender all unspent funds back to the Consolidated Fund. And so you're not permitted to take sums out and set aside for further, to offset other transactions that would have occurred post. And in this instance, it's my understanding that these transactions actually were generated after the year end. So that too would have complicated the breach. The ministry, however, since Friday has provided an additional response, and I will allow them at this point in time to provide an update to the committee. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Auditor General. Ms. Sewell, if you would enlighten us as to the response that was submitted on Friday.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning to the members of the committee and colleagues from the Auditor General's Department and the Minister of Finance. We had two such breaches. One is when I went to the ministry, the funds were, well, persons came to me to say that they had some funds in a deposit account, a special account, I was told, to purchase a bus and some other vehicles. Since I was new, I asked them to, and it was in the new financial year, because I joined that ministry, I think, May to June 2016. I didn't go when it was initially established. And when they came to me with the documents to purchase the vehicles, I wanted to do my own assessment, but I was assured that the funds were there. Yes, I was told that those funds were carried over.
Yes, if I may, yes. Just a little clarification as you go. It was in is that the carryover from the Ministry of Water, Land, Environment and Climate Change?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I was told that the funds, but I was told that the funds were from a special account. At that time, the advice was that it was okay from the technocrats, and that there was provision for that kind of arrangement, because the transaction, they said they had intended to start in the previous year. It happened again under my watch, where we had ordered a motor vehicle for fleet, and I just want to make it very clear that we took a decision, because I didn't buy the bus. I didn't see the need to buy the bus, because coming from Transport Works and Housing, they have a bus there, which we used to lend to the former ministry, and I was of the view that we would continue that kind of arrangement. So I didn't think the bus was necessary. So the funds were used to buy fleet vehicles, and we decided that we would continue to replenish the old 14-year-old and 12-year-old vehicles that were breaking down on the roads. When the vehicle was ordered, near the financial year, there were some hiccups with the provider, because we were told that it would have been delivered within the financial year. It never happened. And so what was done in the accounts branch was they secured the funds, because their view was that if they surrender the funds, but the vehicle would come early in the next financial year and they would not have money to purchase it, and they had already given the purchase order. And the other funds, well, because what was there was for two purposes. The Cabinet Office had given a commitment to pay for consultancy for the merger of, to look into the merger of the Met Office and the Climate Change branch. Somewhere along the line, apparently the process was very protracted. And when they were ready to go to tender, or had gone to tender and was ready to finalize the process, they were told that CAB office was not able to provide the funds anymore. So they were in a pickle. And that activity was long overdue. And so the finance branch, that's what happened. They transferred the funds to hold to pay the consultants. Initially, the advice to me was that, and I know because I was at another ministry where we asked finance for permission, which was granted for a specific purpose. We had an emergency. I was of the view that whatever funds were there with the approval of Ministry of Finance. In my further advice, I found out that, yes, in fact, there was a breach, and the ministry acknowledges the breach. The ministry has now settled down in terms of staffing in the accounts branch, because we had some major challenges when I joined the ministry. And there was a lot of instability in the finance and accounts branch. We had, the PFO was sick and midstream, had to go off on emergency medical retirement. We had her deputy at the time who got U.S. residency and was in and out of the island. So we had a lot of instability. That has been addressed. We have now got a PFO who is to my right, and we have been working very hard since we got the Auditor General's report to stabilize things and to ensure that we have the appropriate systems in place. We still have some staffing issues at the senior level, and we are trying to recruit suitably qualified persons to fill those vacancies. So yes, we acknowledge that a breach happened, and we are committing to ensuring that we keep on track in terms of those policies.
Thank you. Yes. Just to confirm, so the bus was purchased?
The bus was not purchased because, as I said, when I went there about June 2016, and I was told that funds were put in a special account, and I was only told that when they came to me to sign off on the purchase of the vehicles, and I queried where in the budget were the funds. I was told that it was put in a special account, and they had it for more than a year in that account. And I asked them to put it on hold because I wanted to do my own assessment to determine if it was absolutely not necessary for us to have a bus. It took me some while, and my determination was that we didn't need a bus. So we did not use the funds to buy a bus, but we used the funds to buy fleet vehicles.
Madam Auditor General, if I may just ask a question. In a circumstance where a ministry has an allocation in the budget for the procurement of something like a vehicle or vehicles, and goes through the process and issues or signs a purchase order near the end of the financial year, giving rise to a contract with the supplier to purchase those vehicles, but the vehicles are in fact not supplied until after the end of the financial year, and then triggering an obligation to pay for them. Is there any procedure by which the funds may be preserved in some way for that purpose, or is it mandatory to return those funds to the Consol Fund and try and look to a new allocation in the new budget to deal with that? Is there any process by which you can finesse that, so to speak, or is it strictly speaking you have to do it that way?
Yes. Based on the Constitution, it is a requirement that the funds be surrendered. Unfortunately, it is a challenge that all heads of agencies, including myself, have to contend with. I can ask the representatives from the Ministry of Finance to speak more fulsomely to that. There was a time when we had what was called a period 13, where
yes.
ministries, departments, and agencies were allowed to carry the sums for 3 months up to June to offset any incomplete transaction. But arising from the fiscal rules at the time with the introduction of the IMF, that was discontinued. And so the cutoff date is actually even before the 31st of March. It depends on the date issued by the Ministry of Finance.
And before, I'm going to ask the Ministry of Finance to comment on my question, but would you say that this is an ongoing challenge that you see coming up repeatedly in your performance audits, or is this not a really prevalent challenge currently?
Considering the sums involved, I would not say it is prevalent. There are 1 and 2 instances where we have to comment on it because of the breach, but I wouldn't say it's significant. The ministry, however, because we do operate on a sample basis, and the ministry may be aware of others that we are not aware of, because oftentimes the ministry may receive a request to allow for carrying over of funds or removing those funds from the recurrent account to a special account to safeguard.
So would the Ministry of Finance comment on this, in particular, to what extent is this a prevalent practice still, and how do you deal with it now?
Right. Well, I'm not aware that it is a big issue throughout ministries and departments. And as was said by the Auditor General, what usually happens in that case is that you seek permission to set aside the amount, or there is a provision made in the new budget. So by law, what usually happens, Section 24L3 still allows for that 3 months if the ministry decides that 3 months after the end of the financial year for commitments to be paid. So that is still available from time to time. But if not, then usually within your discussions with the ministry for the new financial year, you would ask for that provision to be made in the new budget.
So that provision, that statutory provision to which you just referred, is in the Financial Administration and Audit Act, is it?
Yes.
And so that exists notwithstanding the constitutional rule requiring funds to be returned at the end of the financial year. There is a provision in the statute that allows for the ministry to permit some carryover still. So the issue presumably then was that wasn't utilized in this instance by the ministry.
Right.
Now, Chairman,
Sir,
if I may, before...
Wait, I want to hear Ms. Swell's response, Doctor.
well, my PF1 there, we are, in terms of this carryover, I'm not aware of it, because what I know is that as you have rightly said, Chairman, come the 20th of March or so, everything is closed off. I am aware, however, that you may seek approval from the Ministry of Finance, and interestingly, not to go back, I did that once at a ministry and I was still knocked on the knuckles for it. Yes, and I'm not looking in that direction. Yes, but we were of the view that the portal is closed, everything is closed off. I'm not aware that there's a 3-month provision for us. I know for the agencies that provision exists for them. I'm not aware in terms of the central government that we have a 3-month period. And the truth is too, in terms of making provision for the next financial year, if I would have submitted my budget from November of the previous year. If I start the procurement process January or February, my budget would have already been submitted and been subject to the approval process, so it would not have been there. So, as I said, Chairman, we had some issues in our ministry. There was a time there was absolutely no leadership in the accounts department. I share this with you too. Some of the constraints that we have to work with as permanent secretaries and leaders in our ministries. I had a situation where the PFO was off because she took ill. She was very, very ill. Eventually, she took pension retirement on the grounds of medical conditions. and her deputy, too, he was in the departure lounge. I asked for somebody from another ministry to come. Now, interestingly, a smaller ministry, the deputy is at a higher level than the deputy we have at MEGJC. And I asked for the person to come at the level, to carry her post, to come and just provide some coverage for the ministry at the time when we were in crisis. I wrote to the Services Commission and asked that she be allowed to come in her substantive post as a PA4, or was it a PA3? And it was not approved. And so we were left to expose. For months, I had nobody in the ministry. And so, yes, things happened, but I'm just asking the committee to understand that sometimes we have real constraints. And I couldn't move her. And her PS was willing to send her, but based on the situation, she couldn't come.
You have my sympathies, PS. I'm just trying to understand what the actual rules are.
Yes.
Because from what the ministry is saying, there is provision in the law still, though from what you're saying, PS, you didn't think that was applicable to central government, though you were aware it may be applicable to the agencies. But what is the rule, as you understand it?
Okay. So the law still provides for it. In the Financial Administration and Audit Act instructions, the provision is still there.
For central government as well as...
For central government as well. It is not that we expect that automatically people are going to, ministries and departments are going to be allowed to make these payments. Towards the end of the financial year, the Ministry of Finance usually sends out a circular regarding this matter. And in the last financial year, I know we had allowed persons to pay commitments within 3 months after the end of the financial year. But the provision is still in the
And was that in response to requests, or it was a general
No,
permission?
it's always general. If you're going to do that, it's going to be a general send out.
To everybody?
For everybody.
Wow.
Chairman, thank you. From my read of the prompt, AG, the concern was that it was transferred to another account. So the challenge that we are having now in terms of understanding what the rules are would not apply in this particular case, because it was not a situation where it was clearly the vehicle was ordered and we had come to the end of the financial year. The prompt indicated that it happened at a particular time, 15 months after, which spawns my question now. AG, is it that the transfer of the money to that account was the breach, or is it that the money was spent in a year subsequent to the financial year, or both?
Both. But I just want to clarify the statement made by Mrs. Blake, and I'm going to read directly from the FA Act as it pertains to settlement of undischarged commitments after the close of the financial year. And the Act, as Mrs. Blake has suggested, does provide for a special request to be made of the Ministry of Finance, but there are certain conditions that must be met. A statement has been submitted by an accounting officer in relation to goods delivered, services rendered, or work completed before the close of the financial year. So in this case, it was the goods were not delivered, and as such, it would not have applied, and the ministry should not have granted an approval in that regard. I think it's important for us to clarify this 3 months, and I also believe that it's important for the Ministry of Finance to clarify its position on this 3 months. I do believe that there is some misunderstanding as to whether the rule still applies or whether it doesn't, because there was a circular that was disseminated by the Ministry of Finance that indicated that this rule no longer applies. But there has been no adjustment to the FAA Act to that regard, but there is a circular. And generally, when circulars are issued by the Ministry of Finance, it is understood that it is issued by under the authority of the Minister of Finance, and then would be a rule that we would require. So I believe the Ministry of Finance needs to clarify this issue.
Before I ask Mr. Blake to do so, Could you just respond to the other point about the transfer of funds from one account to another? And you said both. Could you just
Both,
clarify?
yes. Right, because the Act does not permit. All right, so let me backtrack. An accounting officer has the authority to wire funds between objects. So, and of course, there are specific objects now because there are some that the ministry no longer allows. So if you had funds allocated, say for procurement, for goods or services, and you also have funds allocated for capital acquisition, if you're short of funds on the capital acquisition, then you can wire funds from capital acquisition to goods and services. However, we have different heads for recurrent and for capital A and B. An accounting officer is not allowed to transfer between those heads, just within a head. And in this regard, there would have been a transfer out, right.
From recurrent to a capital item or vice versa?
To a deposit.
Oh.
Yes.
Well,
and which is a separate financial pattern. And
I see.
yes, I'll have to.
Because your explanation focused on heads in the estimates,
yes,
right?
And
whereas the
financial
commentary
patterns.
here is about accounts. You know, yeah, and I'm not sure. Could you explain the financial pattern concept? I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. So we have the financial pattern would refer to the different line, and I'm going to ask Mrs. Blake to back me up here because I must admit that I'm a little lacking in that area. But it's in relation to the specific, I would say, item, object type, hope, recurrent, capital A and B and deposits, which is still the vote. So I'm listening to my colleague here.
Feel free to confer.
What was that?
Deposit is not voted. You're not voted on deposit, but the others, capital A, B, and C, capital recurrent A are voted on.
Okay, so the difference, as it's explained to me, is that in the House where you approve the appropriation account, you vote on capital A, B, and recurrent, but the deposit is not voted on, and that is what would separate, distinguish from what I had explained.
Mr. Blake, when we refer to the deposit, what are we talking about? Are we talking about statutory expenditure that's payable whether or not it's voted on, or is that what we're talking about? Like certain positions have to be paid out of the consolidated fund regardless of whether any appropriation bill, or what, are we talking about something different?
Right. Okay, well, the deposit is set up for a specific purpose. So it sums up money received by an MDA. It can be sums received by an MDA for probably a member of the public where you are really just a trustee for that amount. Right? That's basically how we define it. But then there are different types of deposits as well. There are different type of deposit accounts. But generally speaking, it's set aside for a particular purpose. And in most cases, it's not monies that you are going to use as a ministry or department, but you hold it. So like retention fees for a contractor is put in a deposit account because you will have to pay it over at some point. So that's basically what it is about.
So in this instance, AG, in response to the point that Dr. Guy made, there was a transfer between heads or in some way that wasn't permissible by way of
transfer
firing.
From the recurrent to the deposit account.
Yes, that is what it was. It was transferred from recurrent goods and services to the deposit account.
For the purpose of paying for the vehicles?
Yes, because when I investigated, what I was told is the deposit account is there as a temporary measure. So they thought it was okay because it's not something to be held permanently. So this is an interim arrangement to allow for the transition from one year to the other and to allow the ministry to honor its obligations. And as we have said, we have revisited and we are now fully in compliance with the rules.
Well, I thank you, P.S. In a sense, my concern is not so much on your specific case, which you've
Yes.
explained, but more on what the actual rules are going forward, and some clarity around that. And from what we have heard, the specific provision in the Financial Administration and Audit Act requires the situation to have already crystallized prior to the end of the financial year, but the payment has not yet been made. In other words, the other party has completed their performance, and what's left is for the government to pay. Whereas, is it being interpreted more broadly and permitting situations where the performance by the other party may come after the end of the financial year in the form of delivery of a vehicle or whatever the procurement may be? And is that being, in other words, is the ministry interpreting the provision in a slightly more liberal way than the express words would allow?
I'm going to agree that some clarity is needed based on the circular that was sent out. And therefore, the ministry will commit to looking back at that circular. The financial instructions are to be looked at each year, and we are going to look back at that circular and make sure that the financial instructions is in keeping with what was sent out.
Or in keeping with the Act? Because I think you can't issue a circular which is ultra vires the Act. If the Act is no longer, is in terms which are no longer suitable for purpose, then the thing to do is to amend the Act. I don't think you can be issuing circulars which are inconsistent with the express provision in the Act. Yeah. What was the date of that circular? What year, rather?
I need to check that. I think it's, but I need to confirm.
Any further questions from any member on this issue?
Yeah, just about these circulars. Is there any central register of circulars issued by the Minister of Finance and the topics that they're on? Because I find PS can produce a circular to support any position that they want to take, but there may have been 2 subsequent circulars that reverse that. But how would you know, as a minister, for example? Is there any central register of circulars issued on these things with the topics so that somebody can independently search and find what these rules are? I mean, it seems...
It's like gazettes. Yeah, is there any central database of gazettes that you can search? I mean, that's a challenge.
The system only seems to suit Sir Humphrey Appleby, nobody else.
Well, the Ministry of Finance's website has a repository of all the circulars issued by the Ministry of Finance.
Is it indexed? How is it? How is it searchable?
Yes, it is. We have headings in terms of it is done by the year, as well as you can search based on a particular topic. Like if you're looking for traveling circulars, you should also be able to search based on traveling circulars, and it should bring up all those that exist.
Are you confident that it's complete or reasonably complete?
Reasonably complete.
Any other questions on this topic, or can we move on? We can move on. All right. Thank you. Madam Clerk, what's next? We move to the road maintenance.
Well, I thought it was this specific topic. There's just one question I have.
Oh.
It relates to issue 9. And I see here where even the government is was charged a dormant fee on a due to non-funding of an account. It also relates to the penalties due to overdraft facility, and well, there's one other matter, but I'm more concerned about one that, and correct me here, AG, are government accounts allowed to have overdraft facility? 1. 2, the other one is basically a problem in terms of monitoring the accounts. But any idea what that dormant fee was and how long it took effect for.
To answer your first question, we're not permitted to run an overdraft. The second question, I'm just checking the records here to see if I have the breakdown.
The reference in the prompt to a dormant fee due to the non-funding of an account, I'm a little perplexed about that. Yeah, because typically a dormant fee would be charged because there's no activity on the account for a prolonged period, rather than a funding issue. If you know, so could you perhaps explain that?
Mr. Chairman, the only information that I have to share is that the account remained dormant until July 4th, 2016, until a lodgement of a substantial amount was made. So I suspect that there was no activity on the account.
It's all a part of the issues. Been regularized now, and we have written to the bank to ask them to reverse the charges, and we have to do what we have to do. So, and we will keep at it. And also the Chief Internal Auditor has been tasked with the responsibility to review, to audit, to determine if anybody was culpable, that we can take the appropriate action. But suffice it to say that that area is getting close attention. Somebody has been assigned in terms of bank reconciliations, and so we have been now very diligent in that regard. So you should not see, and these again came over from different administration, and we have now streamlined to one ministry, so we should not have that.
Does your ministry operate multiple bank accounts?
Yes, we do. And the ministry they have given us directive to close some, and they are also now auditing other accounts for the central ministry and the agencies. So we have an exercise being undertaken jointly with the Ministry of Finance.
May we move on then? Go ahead.
Just on a wider scale though, because when you see the banks print their dormant accounts, a majority of them are actually for agencies and government departments and agencies. Is the Ministry of Finance, or through whichever government agency, looking at these dormant accounts in an effort in ridding them up, because some of them have balances in them, and if they continue, the balances be depleted over a period of time, and these are taxpayers' money, really. Is there an effort being made in ridding these dormant accounts? And
what about the
putting
Central
back the
Treasury
funds,
Management?
right,
I thought
and
the Central
putting it
Treasury
back
Management was all
to
about
consult funds
eliminating
also.
all that. Yeah.
Is there an effort in getting this done?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, let me just clarify this matter, because I don't want it to be felt that this is pervasive. It's an issue that is pervasive throughout government. Just to add further to what I had shared with you before. In fact, what happened is that an account was open. It's for Jeep. But the account was opened in July 4, 2016, but was not funded until January 23rd, 2017. And I guess because there was no activity on the account, it's registered on the bank system. That's right, yes.
And I think in terms of Jeep, because they probably opened it because it was in another ministry, so to carry it on now when it went over to the new ministry to accommodate its activities, but then by then, some of the activities under GEEP had scaled down.
Ms. Blake, maybe you could comment on the issue about multiple accounts and so on, dormant accounts and what have you, in the context of the thrust to establish a central treasury management system.
Right. So through the Accountant General, I know before we had done a project for ministries and departments to inform of all the accounts that are out there, based on the fact that, as you say, we are trying to consolidate and close some of the accounts. Up to recently, information again went out to the principal finance officers to inform us of all the accounts that are out there via a circular, right? Yes, asking them to provide information on all the accounts that currently exist so that we can continue what I call the mop-up exercise of those bank accounts that are out there.
And are you satisfied, as a minister, satisfied that this is being done as required?
The truth is, there are some accounts that it seems we are now saying that we might have to approach the bank. But there was an issue in terms of them giving us information, some client privilege, etc. So there needs to be, there's some consideration that they have to give us the information. So if we are not satisfied that the ministries and departments have given us enough information, then we'll be looking to actually get the information directly from the bank.
Mr. Chairman, may I just respond to Member Phillips?
Go ahead, please.
We got the request Friday evening from the Minister of Finance in terms of the account. So we are working on it. So in terms of response, we are still within the timeline that they have.
No, it's interesting to know if this is being mopped up and dealt with, and it would be interesting to find out how much money.
It's an ongoing exercise because I remember from when I was in a different position, that whole thrust was already underway, and there were myriad accounts in my ministry for all sorts of things over the in the past, which were eventually, I think, closed or consolidated or whatever. So it's an ongoing process.
Thank you.
We will move to the road maintenance fund, and we have prompts. I have three. And we have three covering annual reports for the years, fiscal years 14-15, 15-16, and 16-17. Madam Auditor General, would you just like to do your thing?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Okay, looking at, there are 3 years. We're looking at altogether 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17. I'm going to suggest that we delay the first item for 14, 15 to 16 when we get to 16, 17 because the issue continues. The second matter relates to the repair to parish council roads contrary to the Road Maintenance Act. That's really what it is. And of course, it involves amount totaling 208 million. We did not receive a response to this specific issue. So, Mr. Chairman, I could ask Mr. Hunter or the PS, my apologies,
so I'm not
to
sure.
respond.
Sorry, I'm sorry, AG, which one you said in terms of the breach with the road, with the parochial road?
Yes, for 14, 15.
Okay, just to inform the House that the fund, the leadership, there's no leadership at the fund. No, normally the executive director would have been here to assist us with the responses of whatever took place under his watch, but the fund does not exist anymore as of the 12th of March. So Mr. Hunter and I will try our best, and given the records that we have. Yes, it was pointed out in a previous audit that the Road Maintenance Fund committed a breach because it was funding parish council roads, which was contrary to their act, because their act says that they are to fund main roads. This was communicated to the fund, to the board. In another life, the board was informed, and I know they were aware, and efforts were made to discontinue the funding of parochial roads by the Road Maintenance Fund. Actually, I saw for myself the effort and recognized that after that breach was identified, that I don't think that there was any breach thereafter, because the board was instructed to ensure that it didn't happen. So I can say for that, again, yes, it happened, directives were given, and it was discontinued.
There seems to have been some thinking in the mind of the then board that there was a distinction between expenditures which were funded via the motor vehicle license fees and expenditures that were funded via the fuel tax.
Yes.
And there seemed to be a view that the fuel tax funded expenditures were not subject to the same restriction as the motor vehicle license fee expenditure, whereas the motor vehicle license fee expenditure was treated as being captured by this restriction that it could only be spent on maintenance for main roads. The fuel license fee expenditure was treated somewhat differently and was made available to assist with the parish councils who had roads that needed...
Maybe the other way around.
Oh.
Other way around.
Other way around.
Yeah.
Okay. The fuel tax was, well, as my understanding is, the fuel tax was what was being used for parish council road expenditures. Because when that fuel tax ceased to be available, that is when the expenditures on the parish council roads had to be curtailed.
Chairman.
Yeah.
Chairman, sorry.
May I type? Because I think the answers will come out. AG, is this particular expenditure related to the JD project? No. Okay, because there was a policy decision that used some of that money for parish council. So I'm just asking whether this one related to that. Okay.
As I said, Chairman, it happened, and actually I recall us doing a cabinet, drafting a cabinet submission to have the matter addressed, and it was felt that it was necessary at the time, but the directive was given and that the practice was discontinued. So I don't know if the AG has any evidence that it continued beyond the time when it was discovered. But they were given specific directive. And to the extent that I recall, the then CEO wrote to say that he was getting a lot of requests from parish councils to fund roads, and he had a concern because, one, that issue in terms of the breach, and secondly, they didn't have enough funds. So he knew that it ought not to have happened, and he was correctly instructed not to let it happen again.
Any comments, Mr. Campbell?
I have you speaking in my.
I'm a little disturbed. You say he was correctly instructed not to have it continue. What?
The Auditor General's report was there for everybody to see, But I know from the ministry's perspective, a directive was given that it should not. Actually, and the truth is, nobody really had consulted the Act when decisions were being taken.
And
to know
does that amount to misconduct in a public office?
Well, you're a lawyer, and I stand advised.
If what you're saying is true, that there was no attempt to consult the Act, that's clear in your mind, that there was no attempt to consult the Act.
No, I didn't say it that way.
But
the truth is, They were established to fund NAA roadworks, and nobody had consulted the act to say it specified main roads. It was when it was brought to our attention by the Auditor General that people say, oh, okay. And so, having been the breach being brought to our attention, the decision was taken. And things will happen. They are not deliberate. Errors will be made, mistakes will be made. The important thing is, what do you do after you make the mistakes? And when the breach was discovered, a directive went, they had the report, it went to the board, and the board was instructed to ensure that we comply with the law.
What concerns me, what was done in relation to this particular officer or officers? Because it moved from an individual officer who ought to have seen what was contained in the act and satisfy himself. And then it moves from there to a board, which I suppose sanctioned what he did. What did the board do in relation to it? And you said this happened in 2014, 2015.
It showed up itself in the 2014-15 audit, so it would have been something before that.
My specific question now is, what did the board do to remedy this particular situation which they found?
Well, going forward, the board ensured, I'm sure, that there was no repeat of the breach.
But in any event, though, just my understanding was that under the JDIP financing arrangements with the Chinese government, that part of the security in quotes for the repayment of those loans was the commitment that the road maintenance fund would be made available for some portion of it anyway for that purpose, and that the parish council road funding was to some extent tapped into that as well. So was there some kind of...
There was some kind of arrangement, but suffice it to say it wasn't formalized in terms of a policy decision, but it happened.
All right. Sometimes it seems that we pursue policies that appear logical without really checking whether they are infringing some legal rule. And then it's picked up afterwards. And it seems to happen fairly, from time to time, which of course is a discrepancy, but I suppose it's a less serious discrepancy than some malfeasance or fraud,
And that's why I wouldn't mind having an audit every week to help to keep me on track, because it's difficult for you as the accounting officer to be looking here, there, and ensuring that persons, even in the agencies, are in line with the regulation and the legislation.
Especially in your ministry, which is almost
the
entirety of government.
Yes.
All right.
I want to ask a question. You mentioned that the Act provides for that the road maintenance fund be spent on NAA roads.
Main roads.
Main roads. Oh, it's specifically said main roads.
Yes.
But NAA roads.
Maintained, yes.
Right. I know that there's a policy that the NAA can also do work on parish council road, especially in the case of emergencies. I don't know if there's a likelihood that there could be any justification.
You see, when the road maintenance fund was set up, it was set up to be funded in a particular way.
No, I'm referring to
I just want to say, the works that NAA would have done on those roads, the funding would not necessarily come from RMF. It would be from the consolidated fund, but they usually do roads in cases of emergency, you have flooding or any disaster, and they have to make the roads accessible, they would do it as an emergency. But they don't sit down and say, well, it's Parish Council Road and we're not going to clear it. They will. But the funding for those, for the Parish Council roads, would not come from the road maintenance fund.
Okay, right.
When the road maintenance fund was originally set up, the source of funding for it was a portion of the motor vehicle license fee.
Yes, a third.
Right.
Yes,
and then subsequently, its funding was increased by a fuel tax allocation.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it is at that point that the road maintenance fund was of the view that that additional funding wasn't caught by the same restrictions. That's the impression I got.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're correct, sir.
But the issue is, when this happened, the gas tax were no longer with road maintenance fund. At that time, he had gone to the consolidated fund directly to repay JDIP loans.
So when that source ended.
Yeah, so they had nothing to do with it at that time. Not this time when this infraction was committed. They had no access to the gas tax. It was already removed and placed in the Ministry of Finance. At this time was totally RMF funding. So the gas tax could not have been confused with the funding that they had at this time. I may say in most cases, when these, leave it.
Could I make one very quick point?
Yeah.
One point, though, Chairman. An examination of the expenditure to which the Auditor General referred. 100 million is for flood mitigation. Now, the presumption that you can achieve flood mitigation by cleaning drains on main roads and ignoring drains on tributary roads defies hydraulic sense. This clearly, the restriction in the law is clearly a construct of the legislator. And it is perhaps a classic example of where the law is an animal. Because, as I said before,
an animal with 3 letters.
the hydraulics of flood mitigation requires main drains and tributary drains to be clean and pristine. And so, to the extent that you want to achieve flood mitigation, $100 million is stated here, it really does make practical sense to think that you can achieve this objective by not dealing with the ancillary drains. The start I'd made that point.
But, again, practicalities and the wording of the statute are not always incongruent, because the statute is drafted with the imagination of the draft and the policymakers informing what's in it. Sometimes, as time passes, events unfold will show that their vision was perhaps too narrow or whatever, and the process of amending it can be very lengthy. So that is where I think sometimes we fall into problems.
Some engineers as MPs. Engineers who practice.
That may or may not have made a difference. Any other questions on this issue? Are there any other points you wish to raise on the RMF? Mm-hmm.
Not for 14-15, for 15-16.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Anyway.
And you should see the heading cost overrun of quantity surveyor budget on the JD project. The concern here was that the requisite approval was not obtained. The NWA, the RMF, responded to say that the board subsequently provided the approval. However, based on the value of the variation, it's a requirement that that approval come from the PS and the NCC, and at that time the cabinet, based on the limit, the threshold. So the sum would have exceeded the approved budget by US 2.71 million.
Okay.
That's the only outstanding issue, because as a matter of fact, you know, it has already occurred, but there was a breach in that regard.
And then, P.S., maybe you could comment on the retroactive or subsequent approval of this overrun. The overrun itself is quite substantial for quantity surveyor services.
Yes.
2.71 million US.
They don't consider it, sir, as a overrun. When we got the report and met with them, they didn't consider it based on the circumstances as an overrun, because one of the things that they have said, there's one component that they would say, okay, variation, because they had to extend the contract because there were disputes amongst the contractors and RMF, and it was protracted because the contractors made claims, they had to do checks and rechecks, which had to be rechecked and re-verified by the quantity surveyor, so they had to extend the time. The other matter, however, it has to do with what they say is the foreign exchange difference, because apparently the contract, they were paid in US. So when there was fluctuation, it reflected that there was an increase. That was their explanation. And they wrote a letter. I remember they wrote me a letter asking, and they wrote to the Auditor General too, challenging the finding and asking what exchange rate was used to calculate to Jamaican dollar. So that is what they raised. What we will do in terms of, I'm going to ask for time to go back to look at it. We may have to get ask for ratification through just to close out the records for this decision. But because they disputed the Auditor General's report, and there were also disputes, there are still disputes with the quantity surveyor and the board. You know, we were hoping that things would have closed out and tightened up, but allow us to look back at it and to see what we need to do to just close the records.
So the surveyor's contract, in terms of his remuneration, was denominated in US dollars?
Yes, that's what they say.
So the J dollar amount to settle it grew because of that fluctuation in the exchange rate.
Yes.
But the actual amount of the contract didn't change in that regard. Is that your understanding?
I have a letter that the CEO had written to the Auditor General to request, disputing what the findings, and to request the Auditor General to state whatever rate was used, because what he contended in the letter that when they are paid at the rate of the day. It wasn't locked like what it was a year before. And so was their explanation.
Auditor General, did you recall what the position was from your point of view on this issue of the exchange rate and who would bear the risk of depreciation in the currency? Was it the quantity surveyor or did his contract denominate his remuneration in foreign currency and thereby protect him from that?
Okay. So let me emphasize that the sums reported in reports, save and except the 533.4, is reported in hard currency. It's the US dollars. So there is a difference in the payment. The variation in the Jamaican dollar rate at that point in time would not have an impact. The next thing, the rate that we used for the conversion is the rate that was stipulated in the contract that should be used. I'm not aware, though I cannot speak to the letter from the CEO.
It came. I
don't recall. I have not had sight of it.
It was
a fixed rate in the contract, or it was a reference rate like the BOJ weighted average spot selling rate as at the date of payment?
The contract is quoted in US dollars.
Usually 3 months.
US dollars.
Okay.
So it was a percentage
right.
of the contract, it was the overall contract.
Chairman.
Just a moment.
while the AG confers, the prompt suggested that RMF indicated the excess was due to changes in the scope of work. So what needs to happen is that RMF needs to therefore provide the AG with the requisite approved variation orders, and this would satisfy the audit query.
I have
The main issue seems to be an approval, that the necessary approval for the variation wasn't obtained at the requisite level. Yeah.
As well.
Well, what they are saying is that in terms of the change of scope, that may not necessarily depends on the quantum, and the percentage change would have required further, approval beyond what was given at the local level. But the Auditor General included the other. But I have the letter here. It was dated November 15, 2016, and it says, foreign exchange rate, the quest billing was done in US and as such would be paid at the going exchange rate at the date of payment. Clarification is being sought by the RMF as to the computation used to determine the excess value derived by the AG of 312 million Jamaican dollars as against US agreed 1.92 million. We note that the FX adjustments would have to be factored in the computation and request of the AUGD, the rate applied to determine the excess. Further, at the original date of the agreement, the ROE was approximately 84 Jamaican dollars to 1 US versus the ROE averaging 122.041 at the end of March 2016. So it's, and I'm just
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we're speaking to the same issue here, but let me clarify that this matter arose from our review of the financial statements. So the figures that we are referring to would be what is disclosed in the financial statement. So we would not be arriving at those figures. They would have been presented in the financial statements. Save and except for the Jamaican dollar rate, let me clarify what, because I believe I made an error when I said that the contract stipulated a foreign exchange rate. It did not stipulate a foreign exchange rate. It stipulated a percentage of which the quantity surveyor would obtain as be right. So it is a 0.48%, which as stipulated here would convert to US 1.92 million. However, US 4.63 million was paid to the contractor, so there's no need for conversion. There is a difference in the amount which should have been paid under the contract. They have in their report
that there was a 312 Jamaican dollar amount as against the agreed 1.92. So what they are saying that the 1.92 that was agreed to be paid, the conversion, yours is lower than what would be lower than what they have because on book because of the ROE at the time when the payment was made. That was their explanation.
Okay, what I'm trying to emphasize is that my focus is not on the Jamaican conversion, but what is stipulated in the contract, which is US. So the Jamaican dollar valuation at that point in time would not have an impact.
Well, what would they have booked? Wouldn't it have been Jamaican? Wouldn't they have converted it for their record?
Who exactly are you referring to?
Wouldn't it, you said you looked at their statement.
Okay, well, so my apologies because I didn't understand the source of the information, because RMF indicated to us that the change was due to changes in the scope of work. So what you're presenting to me now is totally new.
No, what I read from is a letter that they wrote to you, November 2016. And they spoke about the change of the scope of work, which we acknowledge, and I'm asking for time to look back at it to see if that change of scope would warrant approval outside of the agency, because you know it's by tier. And if it does, we will do the necessary retroactive, ask for the necessary ratification of those decisions. But they are also contending that the overstatement has to do with the foreign exchange conversion. And it is here. I have a copy of that.
Their accounts are presumably in Jamaican dollars, right?
Yes.
Whereas the amount due to the contractor, the supplier, the QS, was in US. So I'm just wondering if there's a differential there between what was booked in the financial statements as a liability as at the balance sheet date and what the actual claim which was ultimately paid was. I'm just wondering if that's...
All right, so that it has to be clarified. My response, the response I'm relying on is that it is due to a scope variation, and that is what would have been included in the annual report, and this would have been sent to the RMF before the matter was actually finalized for publication in the annual report.
They got it, and so, they responded by writing, Madam AG, so I will share the letter with you.
So I'm not,
because they had copied it,
and it would be a significant difference for Jamaican dollar valuation, so it's quite curious. So we'll have to look at it.
All right. Any other questions on this matter? Yes. Perhaps what we would ask is that this particular issue could be clarified, and
we'll work together.
If we could hear what the clarification is at a subsequent meeting, that would be helpful, even if you don't all have to come for it. Yes.
Chairman, if the issue is, there is some concern on the AG's part. And what the outstanding concern that she has, then the minister respond to her. Normally, I think they send copy to the committee, so they respond to her. They don't have to come back here. Respond to her, and then it's passed on to us.
Yes, I'm just saying, hopefully, when we get the response, we'll be satisfied with it, and we won't need to ask for anybody to return. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Just a question. I don't know if the AG or the PS. What is the value of the change in scope compared to the US dollar?
We will provide that information.
Okay, right. So.
There doesn't seem to be clarity on what the change in scope was quantified at, because the PS is looking at correspondence suggesting that the issue is really one of exchange rate conversion, whereas the Auditor General is saying that the issue from her perspective was one of a variation of the scope of works. So there's a sort of inconsistency which needs to be resolved, or both. So that was the 15-16. Is there any other issue you want to raise, or for the subsequent year?
I'll take you then to the second item, issue number 2 for 16-17, which, as I indicated earlier, is also coming forward from 14-15, and this is in relation to outstanding advances, which at the time of reporting was 71.87 million. Of course, the clearing of these advances is dependent on the submission of the requisite supporting documents as confirmation of the works that were actually undertaken to have it properly recorded as cost. This matter is still outstanding, and I'll allow the PS to speak to this.
Did you want to?
Again, Chairman, members, this matter is quite simple. It's a timing matter. I can say with perfect certainty that in all instances where advances have been made to the NAA, that they are subsequently verified by way of documents. Indeed, and in fact, to speak to the authenticity of the documentation that we send, the situation that obtained between the RMF and the NAA, and I would have spoken to this on a number of occasions over the last many years. The NAA would undertake works. They would then send the documents to the RMF. The RMF had a protocol where they had 10 days in which to send out their auditors to verify, and upon verification, payment would be made. We improved on that process where joint inspection is actually done between the RMF and the NAA, and the so-called measurement sheet have 2 signatures. In fact, the standard operating procedure requires the NAA to give the RMF 3 days notice of inspection, with a caveat that if they do not avail themselves to that invitation, they are obliged to accept the measurement sheet submitted by the NAA. Suffice it to say that in most, if not all, instances, there's been joint inspection and the returns have been made. We did send to the Auditor General's Department yesterday, because we sort of got into this at the tail end. We did send to the Auditor General's Department a summary of the returns. Want us to understand that in
completion deadlines have not been met, prompting the QS to increase their fees by a further, at that point in time, 29%. And I cannot tell if it's 29% because it's a little, or it's a 0.29% for the balance to the completion of the JDIP to September 2014. And he goes on to say that approved by the board would have been the 0.485%. Additional approval required by the board is an additional 0.408%. That resulting in a total approval required of 0.893%, and that would have increased substantially the amount.
Remember, I said that there were 2 reasons he proffered for the increase. That in terms of the scope of the work of the QS, because I did speak about the fact that his the engagement had to be extended because there were many disputes with contractors and they had to go back in the field, so he was re-engaged to do the re-verification. So I said that, and then he's also contending about the foreign exchange. So I did say that, Madam, that his tenure was extended, the contract was extended because of the disputes. And so, but we are going, I have committed to looking at it to ensure that whatever it is regularized and to break it out.
The board did approve it, but that apparently is not sufficient given the quantum involved, so that needs to be regularized.
It depends. We will look at it, Chairman, because what I need to know is what percentage is attributable to the change of scope, and as I said before, that may not need external approval, depends on the amount or the percentage of the increase, and what is attributable to, as he contended in his letter, to foreign exchange losses.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there seems to be 3 factors impacting this too, and I don't know if they can be separated or they're compounding effects. But there would have been increases just due to fluctuations, perhaps largely occasioned by exchange rate movements. There would have been increases due to variations, which is changing and expanding the scope of work. And there's an increase due to the rate being charged by the QS, which has really reflected the extended period of administration that
I thought that the second and
QS
third
would
were
have had to be involved in.
I thought the second and third were one and the same, that the variation in scope was by virtue of the protracted period that was required to settle all these disputes.
No, I don't think, as I'm understanding it, that is correct.
Can I offer a quick input? As I understand it, based on what the Auditor General has read, the QS's fee is calculated as a percentage of the certificate. And if that is the only trigger for fee, I'm saying, just if the QS's entitlement is a percentage of the certificate that he certifies, then a change in scope may or may not. A change in scope does not necessarily increase the quantum of anything. It just means instead of doing 10 here, you do 10 there. So if the contract says fix 10 kilometers of road in Belfield, and then you issue a variation to do 10 kilometers of road in another location, that's a variation, but it does not necessarily mean it's a change in, well, it's a change in scope, but not, yeah. Okay.
Mr. Hunter,
and secondly,
Mr. Hunter, when I was at NWC with you, you schooled me sufficiently in the differences between variations and fluctuations, and I understand that. But separate from the percentage of the certificate, which could be occasioned by either fluctuations or variations, there's a third factor that I'm hearing the Auditor General refer to, which is the rate, the percentage rate was increased because of the extended administration required due to the contract not being completed in the period of time anticipated, that the percentage rate charged by the QS was also increased, and that would have been on top of the increases due to variations and fluctuations. So in fact, it would have compounded those increases. So all I'm asking is when you do the breakout, it's not just two factors you have to look at. You have to look at what was occasioned by fluctuations, what was occasioned by variations, and what was occasioned by the change in rate.
And the variations of which you speak are variations in the underlying contract that the certificates are rendered under, that is original percentage applied to.
Variations in the scope
of his work or of the actual contract?
Of the contract, because that is, he's being paid a percentage of the contract. So if the road is extended, for example, by 20%, then just by virtue of the variation, that is going to increase his fees by 20%. So there are really three factors that you need to break out to see what is the impact of each of them.
Can I make one last point, though, Chairman?
Before you do, I mean, it's the way in which the prompt is worded. It talks about changes in the scope of work and not seeing approved variation orders. And does that relate to the underlying contract that he was providing QS services in relation to, or does that mean changes in his scope of work? Yeah.
The overall contract, there would have been a change in scope that would have affected the QS's.
I would just caution very quickly that contractors will make claim, and they will claim for anything and everything. And the contract provides for an adjudication process where all claims, whether it's for fluctuation, whether it's for prolongation in time, whether it's for exchange rate, that someone adjudicates these claims and hand down a finding. So that process is an important part, and every contract has that clause that wherever the contractor makes a claim, it has to be adjudicated and not taken at face value. That's the only thing I need.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Pierce,
Yes.
the letter, the corresponding you read from a while ago, that was addressed to the Auditor General?
Yes, sir.
Because I noticed she only make reference to the change of scope. She hasn't made any reference to the...
Well, she said she hasn't seen the letter, but I have it because...
But you got a copy?
Yes, sir.
Right, you got a
And I
copy.
have promised
And the
to
original
share
went to
it
her
with you.
office. So it's strange she hasn't gotten that and you have a copy here. Mr. Hunter wouldn't address the one that she read. That came from the Executive Director of Road Maintenance Fund, addressed to you and copied to the PS. But reference is only made to the change in scope. And I'm sure that came from his document. Okay? So strangely, this one somehow disappears somewhere along the way. Because no reference made to it.
Yeah, but in the prompt, it's talking about variations in the relative to the contract sum, which really, to my mind, would be would have an impact on what the QS is paid, but that would have been an approval process that related to that contract, and or would there have to be, would there have to be a separate approval process in relation to the QS's fees if the QS's fees are just a percentage of what is approved?
Jim, what I'm talking about here, well, what I'm talking about here, the increase here, the amount of 535.4 million, part of it is attributed to the exchange rate because the payment is calculated in US dollars, but are paid in Jamaican dollars. Am I correct? Right. So you'd find an increase there. So I'm saying if we have a problem here, it should not only include change in scope, but it must also reflect all the reasons that caused the increase. And if, as they explained at the time when it started first, the exchange rate was $80 to 1, whatever, you have a 80. And at the time when they calculated the last one, there's 120 odd. So this would create a serious, increase. So that has to be taken into consideration. The scope was taken from where the financial statement. So it ought to be in this report or in this thing. It must include all the factors. We cannot include one. If you include one and says only in stranger scope, it definitely indicate incompetence or something on the part of those who are doing it down there. But if you include all the other factors, including the exchange rate that RMF had no control over, this would definitely read completely different and give a different impression than what is given here now.
Perhaps. And as the other general has indicated, if the contract with the QS was denominated in US, a change in the exchange rate wouldn't require an approval process because the contract was what was payable in US.
No, it was paid in Jamaican dollars, calculated in US.
But if it's calculated in US and if they paid the J dollar equivalent of what was due,
yes,
then that would have been authorized payment.
No, but what I'm saying here, it was paid 4.63 at the equivalent of $4.63 million.
Right, which is a big excess.
An increase of 2.71 million.
That has nothing to do with exchange rate.
Hold on a man.
Yeah.
The 2.17 here does not take into account only variation. It included the exchange rate. It was paid a total of 4.63 for all the thing. So include both, not only the variation, but the exchange. What comes to exchange
I'm not
rate?
sure how exchange rates comes into that.
Because it's contract. You weren't listening to what I was saying. It's contract.
But if the contract was 2.71 million US and he's paid 4.63 million US.
No, 1.92 at the time.
US, and he's paid 2.71 million more.
Yes.
US more. That is not a function of exchange rate differential. Because that is a US dollar increase.
Well, obviously it was raised, and I'm just reading from...
Yes, Mrs. Honest.
The concept that Member Warmington is trying to get to is a very complex one, but I actually understand where he's coming from. In order for us to very clearly see what took place with the variation, as auditors would often do, we would be required to do a reconciliation in Jamaican dollars, doing the necessary conversions for US. So if it is that they just take a Jamaican dollar figure and use the old exchange rate, you could find the US value being higher than if the approach was to take the Jamaican dollar to the current exchange rate. So that is actually the point Mr. Warmington is trying to make. It would be good, AG, if the Auditor General sat down and gave to us the total variation and then dissect what is as a result of a change in scope, which can be explained, what is as a result of change in the exchange rate, decide to peg it to a particular space and time, and most critically, a point made by Member Bunting, which actually makes no sense to me. If it is that the QS has a rate, the rate is implicit that if the volume of your work increases because of change of scope, your percentage rate should compensate against whatever the variations in your contract end up being. It should not require that you are allowed, unless so contracted, to vary your percentage rate charge. So of all the contention, I think that's where we should really look to see if the QS rate of, say, 4% was able to move to 5 or 6%, and that was not so contracted. And I think that's the sum total of where our investigations need to go, and then the clarity provided to the members.
Based on what you're saying, the statement here that the contractor was paid 4.63 million US may in fact not be a fully accurate statement, because that may be by reference to an exchange rate which wasn't applicable when those payments were made. And it may in fact, if you look at the actual exchange rate at the time the payments were made, the total may be less. That's one of the points you're making. And I think the point in relation to the change of rate, what I gather from Ms. Sewell, was that the justification for that was not so much the scope of work of the underlying contractor's role being changed, but rather the role that the QS was required to pay as a result of the myriad disputes and so on. They must have made some kind of representation that the rate should be adjusted because it was beyond what was originally contemplated.
And also, too, Chairman, I may just add, in terms of the change of scope, when that contract was in force before the Ministry of Transport Works and Housing was established, so we inherited it then. And with the new then administration added Jeep, and Jeep was not a part of the original contract. And so that would add, and also the special routine maintenance program. So that would account for the additional work that they would have been required to do. It would have been difficult to assess from upfront what the additional cost would be, because we know how the special routine maintenance and the G program was administered. So, as I said, we would look at it to see if we can ratify retroactively, but it is what it is, that G was added years after, and the special routine maintenance program was added to the work program of the quantity surveyor. Because it was JDIP's funds that were used to do the JEEP program. So they were brought under the umbrella of the entire program, the overall program.
But the decision to adjust the rate, the percentage...
That we will have to look into to determine the justification and
how that was approved.
And how that was approved, yes.
Yeah. All right. Anything else on this, Madam Agee?
Mr. Chairman, more than to say that I agree with the comment made by Member Holness in terms of the area of focus, and that's exactly the area that we focused on. The fees increased from 0.485 to 0.893. We saw partial approval, and when you do the conversion, we advised the RMF that the board approval would be insufficient because it would have exceeded the threshold and would now require the approval of the permanent secretary as well as the NCC, and I believe we cabinet in this regard based on the threshold at the time.
All right. So in terms of clarification, that whole issue will be looked at, and you'll determine to what extent further approvals are indeed required, and come back to us to explain the process by which that will be regularized.
Oh, yes.
Yes. All right. Or send in
an
explanation.
Report.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Finish, sir?
Yes, ma'am. You're ready to depart. Is that it? Yes. Thank you for coming. Thank you for...
Thank you.
Yes. So these...
We're done?
Okay. So, members, I think we've completed the issues on the agenda. Any other business? There being no other business, yes, thank you. Date of next meeting? Well, when will the ministry be ready for us and so on?
I'm not sure. You want to set it for 3 weeks to ensure that they have some time?
Yes, is there an available date?
Yes, I don't have these new diaries. We used to have diaries with all the dates on one thing. So the 8th would have been
Next
and
week.
then it would have been the 15th, so it would have been the 7 and 5, yeah, the 22nd. It would be the 22nd.
Members, we're proposing that the next meeting will be on the 22nd of May, Tuesday the 22nd of May, so as to allow the Ministry of Finance to be prepared for what it is we'll be dealing with on that date. Would someone move for the adjournment? Yeah. Thank you.